This episode of Dominaria's Judgment is brought to you by StarCityGames.com and the StarCityGames.com weekly sale. And this week, that's bonus bucks. Ka-ching. So everything you buy from Monday, April 26th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time to May 3rd at 9 a.m. Eastern Time on StarCityGames.com, the following week, that May 3rd, May 7th week, you're going to get 10% back of that purchase dropped on your account in store credit. So normally, I direct you to StarCityGames.com/sale. Point out a few things that'd be cool to buy. No, it's just literally everything. The list just starts with Khan's Run and just keeps running. So just go to the StarCityGames.com site, search up what you want, and if you order it by Monday, May 3rd at 10:59 a.m. Eastern Time, that following week, 10% back will show up on your account in store credit. You deserve a bonus. And this week, StarCityGames.com has you covered. This week's Dominaria's Judgment is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel, the #1 store for Magic the Gathering inspired apparel. Take a look at their t-shirts, hoodies, stickers, and just general stylings at coalesceapparel.shop. Then use gift code SCG at checkout to save 10% on your entire order. And seriously, I want to emphasize that sticker part. Shirts are cool, but you can send a targeted message with a sticker. Slap it on your deck box if it matches your commander, or if you really want to get inventive, find a way to slap the 3x4 sticker on your 2.5x3.5 Magic card, maybe with a sleeve, maybe with a hard case. You're inventive people. You'll find a way to make it work. So take a look at coalesceapparel.shop, check out their product lines like Wooburg Forever and Ravnica University, and see what catches your eye. Remember, use gift code SCG at checkout to save 10%. Coalesce Apparel and Design. No one made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 3 of Dominaria's Judgment, brought to you by StarCityGames.com and hosted by me, Dom Harvey, along with Ari Lax, where every week we will take you through the ins and outs of the modern format. And last week we went fairly... We took a broad sweep of the format. We went over all of the decks that you might expect to see in the average modern tournament that you play in, and some that you might not expect to see, but you will anyway, because that's just how modern works. For this week's episode, we're going to do something a bit different. We're not going wide, we're going tall, going deep, whichever you prefer. We will go in depth on what I think... people mostly agree is the best deck in Modern at this point, one of the litmus tests for any new deck that you want to take to a tournament. And that's Selesnya Company, Green White Heliod, depending on who you ask. And I think we both agree that it's the top dog at the moment and has remained so through Strixhaven and some of the recent developments. But we maybe disagree on how we arrived at that conclusion, where for me, I wasn't quite sure why this deck was even good to start with, and it rising to the top and staying there was a sign that I didn't know what was going on in Modern anymore and had to really rethink the format from the ground up. Whereas you have been singing this deck's praises for a long time, even in the days of Uro and Field of the Dead, and you were a somewhat early adopter of this deck.
Yeah, so to be fair, I actually had a similar experience when I first saw the deck performing well. The same Magic Online user, Coert, C-O-E-R-T, top-aided 2 challenges in 2 weeks, I believe, with the list. And you just look at it, and it really doesn't make a lot of sense. There's like these Conclave Mentors and like 5 cards that put counters on them. It's, you know, maybe a little more, but like it's a lot of really unrealistic scenarios you have to create for that card to be good. And it just didn't make a lot of sense, but I was, you know, browsing the different places I would put Skyclave Apparition in the format. So I played a few matches with it, and it just like immediately blew me away. You don't have to play... I think it doesn't take a lot of experience with and against the deck to really understand how good it is.
Yeah, at first, on paper, it looks like the kind of deck that we would feature in the Nonsense of the Week segment at the end, whereas, that's kind of cool, and good for them that they did well, but I didn't know if I could recommend this in good faith myself. But as you say, I don't think it takes that long playing either with the deck or against the deck to realize that it really puts you in a bind a lot of the time, certainly if you're playing against it, where you show up with just like a generic creature deck or some of these like aggro decks, aggro combo decks, which may have a lot going for them in general, but really structurally are unfavored against Heliod. And in the past, there have been best decks in Modern where, as long as you come prepared for them, you can beat them. So we mentioned this in the context of Dredge, where it may be unhealthy if Dredge is the best deck in the format, but you at least have a template for how to beat it if you want to. And if you care about doing that, you probably can. With Heliod, it often feels like either your deck lines up well against it already coming in, or you're going to be behind, and there's really not that much you can do about it.
That's, I mean, thinking back to the other times that these green creature combo decks have been the best decks in the format, that's kind of how it's always been. Back when it was Birthing Pod, or back in, there was like a period where the Obzon Company deck was mathematically the best deck in the format. I believe that was on the SCG tour, Logan Mize was just like top 8ing every week with it and losing to Amulet Titan.
But that sounds about right. And what always struck me about those decks, and this is maybe why I had to remove those blinders myself initially, was I lumped it in with those decks where historically those have been good as exploits that you choose when the format is warped. So in Eldrazi Winter, I know that I believe it was you, correct me if I'm wrong, but also a few other people were on that deck for the Eldrazi Pro Tour, where if you were in on the joke, then you played Eldrazi, but if you were really in on the joke, you played Abzan Company, which was good against Eldrazi and also good against the gnome decks and then some of the anti-Eldrazi decks. And that deck stuck around for a few months, but then as soon as Iovugan went away, people picked up their lightning bolts and their snapcaster mages again, and even though the format was objectively much less powerful, the deck was also less good because it wasn't as good in a fair fight, and people could now justify fighting fair again. Likewise, when there's been some fast linear deck that doesn't have much interaction, usually a deck like Devoted Druid pops up because it can race those decks, and it's usually more consistent than those decks. But it just doesn't want to face off against cards like Fatal Push. Likewise, the very first Heliod decks, when Once Upon a Time was legal and Amulet Titan was the best deck, Heliod itself, powered by Once Upon a Time, was one of the decks that rose up that could compete with that. And so it felt like those categories of deck were always maybe not necessarily the best choice in and of themselves, but contextually good given what was going on at the time. And it didn't seem to me like the context made sense for this deck to be good. So I think I was underrating how good it was just out of context on its own merits, and then also maybe misevaluating its place in the format at the same time.
I think that, so at least when I think about these decks, I kind of think about them in context of how they actually win the game. And there's 4 main ways these kind of green creature decks will actually end the game. There's actually comboing off. There's the like 1-card combo where they just tutor up some hate card and that just ends the game. You can kill all your opponent's stuff, which I believe was like the initial way that people did this was just, Eternal Witness my path to exile your next thing, witness it back again, off company, whatever. But we get to go a little more direct to the point with Skyclave Apparition these days. Or you can have Grindy Beatdown. And the exploit times have been when decks are good at 2 of those 4. So like the Devoted Druid deck is pretty good at being a combo deck and pretty good at finding a hate card off of all its tutors. Not very good at like killing things or doing Grindy Beatdown. But like the decks that have actually been the best in the format are good at least 3 out of 4. So like the Birthing Pod decks were really good at comboing off or having the hate cards or Grindy Beatdown, but not so good at like the kill everything game. There's just some structural stuff with Birthing Pod that's not worth pursuing that makes it hard to like just apply kill spells every turn of the game. And the Heliod deck definitely falls into 3 of those categories. It's not the best at the Grindy Beatdown, but it kind of encroaches on that a little bit, but it's really good at comboing. It doesn't have tutors. It just like plays 4 of the cards that are good at hating out other decks. And it's really good at just killing all of its opponent's creatures, which is why especially when Prowess is the like largest macro archetype in the field, it has really succeeded.
I'm sure we'll talk a lot about where the deck stands in Modern right now, but looking at the history of the deck is interesting itself, where you look at the list from just after Theros Beyond Death came out, where there hadn't been much time to refine these decks, and some of the tools that we have now weren't there at the time, and also the context in which these decks had to operate was a lot different. The decks themselves are a lot more combo focused in a way, but they have like these overlapping combos where your 2-drop now is Anafenza Kindry Spirit instead of something like Aureoch Champion, and you compare that with Kitchen Finks is one of your other 3-drops, and then that kind of works well with Heliod as another combo piece, and your Ranger Captains can get the Ballista for Heliod, but can also get the Viscera Seer to like put together the part C of the part B combo if it comes down to that. So these decks are much more combo focused, but I don't know firstly if Once Upon a Time made it much easier to get your thing from column A and your thing from column B, so it made more sense there. And then also just the competition is stronger now. We have Skyclave Apparition, we have other good 2-drops competing with those slots, and also like Kitchen Finks just doesn't really feel like a modern quality card anymore, if it ever did. It's, a lot of people, myself included, have a somewhat sentimental attachment to it, but I don't know if I'm really trying to win, if I can justify putting that in my modern deck anymore.
Yeah, and I think that some of the initial list referring to the old combos was just literally slow movement in the format. Everyone knows that the Kitchen Finks combo is good, and they just spliced the two combos together. Prowess was also a big deck at that time, so they're just like, oh, Kitchen Finks is probably fine there. It really isn't, but and I think that we've just kind of cut away the parts of the deck that are old and clunky.
And then if you look at, I would say, summer of last year, before Coert put the modern builds of this deck on the map, it's almost like a form of amnesia took place where instead of using that creature combo shell as a template, instead people were trying to reinvent the wheel here. So you saw early this with like actual Hardened Scales, not even Conclave Mentor, which hadn't been printed yet, which would come along in a month or two, but just Hardened Scales, Collected Company, and a bunch of like walking ballistas that you couldn't even company into, but you needed those to like pair with your Heliod. And if you drew Hardened Scales, and I guess Scales into Ballista is still good against a lot of opponents, or at least was back then. So you had these very wacky looking lists, which in retrospect now look maybe ahead of their time insofar as you change a few cards here and a few cards here and a few new tools get printed and the deck takes on the shape which we all recognize now.
Yeah, and I think even you're talking about Court, there's like this brief period where the Hardened Scales are in their deck, and then they just immediately fall out. So yeah, it's really just I think a case of people just playing the deck more and more and just cutting the cards that aren't good for things that like might be good, and then just striking gold eventually with the shell that we have today. If you are looking to sell your Magic the Gathering cards, it's never been easier than with StarCityGames.com. Make the best of our 30% store credit bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry when you use any of our 4 simple ways to sell located at starcitygames.com/sell. You can check out our buy list, box up your cards and send them our way with the ship and sell program. Come on in to the Star City Game Center in Roanoke, Virginia for that personal touch. Or if you have everything, 500,000 cards, you want to store and you want to move some bulk, we'll come to you. And seriously, when we're talking about these large collections, Star City does mean they will come to you. The list of places goes from Ohio to New Jersey and elsewhere. Like, seriously, I've driven from Ohio to New Jersey. That is not a short drive. So head on over to starcitygames.com/sell, that's SELL, for more details on all these great options, and maybe clear up a little space in your life for your next project, even if that happens to just be even more Magic cards or another Commander deck.
So before getting into that shell, let's briefly explain how it works. And I think that if you've played March Modern recently on Magic Online, which is the only place you really can play it, and we'll get into how that affects Heliod maybe more than any other deck in due course, I'm sure. But let's get into exactly how the combo works and then how the shell around it works as well.
Yeah, so the baseline combo is the Heliod Sun Crown has a triggered ability, which is whenever you gain life, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Spike Feeder has an activated ability. Spike Feeder is a 1/0/0, comes in with 2 +1/+1 counters. You remove a +1/+1 counter from it, you gain 2 life. So you remove a counter, you gain 2 life, Heliod triggers, you put a counter back on the feeder. That's the loop. You can add a Conclave Mentor to this loop, so that every time you remove a counter and add a counter, you get an extra counter, and then suddenly your Spike Feeder becomes arbitrarily large. And then you can start removing that arbitrary number of counters and spreading counters around your creatures, and your opponent loses to however many infinite power things you have. But then there's also the Heliod Walking Ballista combo that got Walking Ballista banned in Pioneer. So if you give Walking Ballista lifelink, if you remove a counter from it to deal damage and it's still in play after it deals the damage, you get a counter back on it because it has lifelink, and you gain a life, and Heliod puts a counter on something. So yeah, they're pretty straightforward combos. Not a lot of rocket science to it. Heliod gives lifelink to the ballista, and then the ballista does the damage, and then you gain the life. Pretty straight.
Rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
Yeah. And usually what that means is the ballista has to be bigger than a 1/1. So that often sets the floor at 6 mana, sometimes spread across 2 turns, where you need a 2/2 ballista, and then that ballista needs to gain lifelink. But sometimes you can cheat that count in various ways. So there are lists of the deck that have Pendelhaven or Noble Hierarch, where if you can attack with your 1/1 ballista, make it a 2/2 from Exalted, then you can cut a mana off that way. Pendelhaven means you can get your ballista to a 2/3, and then you take the first counter off, it goes to a 1/2, doesn't die, and then just the loop and the repetition starts happening. Or if you have Conclave Mentor, then your 1/1 ballista becomes a 2/2 ballista. If you have Auriok Champion, then your 1/1 ballista comes into play, the Heliod triggers, puts a counter on it, and so there are various ways to fudge that math in a way which, if you don't know about those when you're playing against a deck, you can make some fatal miscalculation where you think you can take the shields down when you really can't.
Yeah, and a lot of this whole thing is predicated on the fact that Heliod is often just hanging around as an indestructible enchantment. And I don't, if you're interested in Cube, I would suggest listening to the 540. But in their episode, I guess not the week that this is coming out, but the previous week, they talked about how in Cube, enchantment is just the most miserable card type because you have to have a very specific set of interaction to deal with it. And Heliod is like really hard to deal with as an indestructible enchantment. And not only that, an indestructible enchantment that is on the stack as a creature. It's just like really weird. You can't negate it. It's just a problem across the board.
Yeah, if you were designing a card from the ground up with the sole aim of being as difficult to interact with in the modern card pool as possible, I think it would look exactly like this, basically, where the weird god status that makes it a creature sometimes and not a creature other times, it's like, Force of Negation would not be a good card against this deck anyway, but it would at least have relevant targets in the form of Heliod sometimes, or, other things that only interact with non-creature spells specifically, which is, you play against humans and your Heliod gets Kite Sail freebooted. Like, that's a way they could conceivably steal a game. That can't happen, because it's a creature in your hand, it's a creature on the stack, but it's not a creature on the battlefield for the purpose of a preemptive Lightning Bolt or Fatal Push, for example. So, when you're looking to assemble the combo with your own Collected Company, it can see Heliod because it's technically a creature. So it kind of, every aspect of it works in your advantage insofar as it being a creature, and then the times where it's not a creature, that also works to your advantage as well.
Yeah, it's my initial experience that kind of blew everything open for me with this deck was just like casting Heliod against someone still in the queues playing Jund and realizing that it was just going to be there for the rest of the game. There's nothing they could possibly do. And I could just spend the rest of the game doing whatever I wanted. And they just had to exist under the threat that they could never tap out or tap down because I could just spike feeder them. It was rude.
And this ties into your framing of the deck as almost like a Spellskite tribal deck.
Yeah. So, we mentioned Auriok Champ. So the whole thing is basically every creature in the deck in some way ends up in a spot where, I guess I should start at the top, where imagine your Spike Feeder starts with 3 counters on it. You can remove a counter. If they cast a kill spell on it in response, like a Lightning Bolt, that would be the scariest thing, right? It's like a 3-mana 2/2. Well, if it starts as a 3/3, you can just remove a counter again and go off again, and who cares? And it turns out that like every creature in your deck that you'd want anyways just does that. So like Conclave Mentor, yeah, it's going to start as a 3/3. You just go off from there through a piece of removal. Auriok Champion, you have the life gain trigger on Spike Feeder entering the battlefield, and your opponent has to act then, otherwise you'll combo off, and then, well, you can respond to that. Even something like Scavenging Ooze, just like you're just going to pay a mana and gain a life, and you can just spell scale multiple times with that card.
You also get to kind of dictate the pacing of the game as well, where let's say you play a Spike Feeder and you have no other boost for it, so it's just a 2/2. If you start things off by removing a counter, then yeah, they can break that up with one removal spell, but if you just pass a turn, if you're not under any immediate impetus to act, then if they take the initiative by trying to cast a Lightning Bolt, well then you just respond a new combo. So they either need an additional removal spell on top of that, at which point your one Spike Feeder has traded for 2 cards, and that's usually a fine exchange. Or you get to untap and then present something else, which adds another layer of protection in its own right, whether it's Oriel Champion or a second Spike Feeder, let's say, or a Collected Company, or maybe the best spell sky in this deck full of spell skies is Ranger Captain of Eos, which can help to assemble that secondary combo with Walking Ballista. And in fact, you often see lists with just 2 or even 1 copy of Walking Ballista now, because you can't collect a company into it, but you can company into Ranger Captain, which finds it. And Ranger Captain can sacrifice to prevent the opponent from casting non-creature spells that turn. And so you could play against a deck with a handful of, let's say, lightning bolts full of fatal pushes, and none of that matters. They cannot possibly overload your removal on the combo turn if you have Ranger Captain clearing the way there. Off a Collected Company or something like that. And Ranger Captain, just in general, I think this is one of the cards that really helped to level up the deck, is focusing hard on this card, where there are a lot of things which it hoses either explicitly or just by accident. So, Storm, for example, you could imagine maybe being a tricky matchup where, they've got some interaction and their median Goldfish is probably a little faster than yours, and you don't have many ways to interact with them. But you have this card that you want to play in your deck anyway that just shuts them down, that they cannot possibly go off through unless they have removal for it. And then there's other things like Bring to Light is probably the card that gained the most in popularity over the past week in Modern, and Ranger Captain happens to be excellent against that. Or there are just so many things where when you start looking for them, you see good uses for this card basically everywhere.
Yeah, and I think that this also, people forget that Spellskite originally was like, it was protection for your stuff, and it was also a hate card because it just shut off the Infect decks and it hampered Splitter Twin. And when we talk about this deck being, tribal Spellskites, like, it means it in that aspect. They're not just protecting your creatures. When you have an Auriok champion, there are just red and black decks in the format, and they lose the game. When you have a Ranger Captain, it hates all this stuff out. So that's why this deck is so good at that second aspect of these decks, where even if it doesn't have a tutor toolbox of hate cards, it just naturally plays a bunch of hate cards that just hate everything. And Ranger Captain just happens to be this headliner.
Yeah, it's not even like you have to make the choice of, do I try and assemble my combo, or do I zag this way instead and maybe tutor up my Eidolon of Rhetoric, let's say. Like, your Eidolon of Rhetoric, in this case, is your combo piece. Those cards just come stapled together for free.
Yeah, it's the average card quality in this deck is just really something else. The
other, I would also just, as a final thing on Ranger Captain, sometimes, even if there's no single card interaction, there are just a lot of decks in Modern that like casting non-creature spells. Like, that's a decent chunk of the format. And so sometimes, let's say you play against Tron, and they probably have something like Aurel's Dust or Ugin coming down the pipeline. You can delay that for at least a turn, and often that's the turn you need to get your combo together. Or against a control deck, let's say, if it's already found a card for you, and if it sticks around, then you get to pick a fight whenever you want, and if they spend a removal spell on it, then usually you're fine with that too. So just as a card that can buy some time, it's excellent, even in matchups where there's no one specific use for it.
Yeah, and the interesting part in these decks is that you're not even layering too hard on chain things to get off Ranger Captain. You're not like, Brenton Forge Tending or something. You're not like, oh, I need to find an additional hate card. It's just like, no, my stuff is good as is. And the only thing that these decks really pack are these sideboard giant killers. And that's because in some matchups you are emphasizing that kill everything aspect. And then you get to add another 4 Shriek Maws to your deck and just really bury your opponents who showed up with, Tarmogoyf, Death Shadow, things that died to Giant Killer.
Yeah, you do see occasionally a Hex Drinker as a sideboard target, which sometimes is just a fine card in a fair game, and also is a juicy thing to get off Ranger Captain if you need just something that can, I guess, literally level up into a big threat. But I do wonder if that's a realistic plan if the central conceit of the deck is you're inherently more resistant to removal than it seems like you should be, because all of your creatures are either spell skies, or they give you a card back, or you have to kill them in a specific window. Hex Drinker is just like a big dumb idiot who, has a juicy target on it, and I guess you can, by leveling it up aggressively, make them use their instance before it gets that protection, for example, but I don't know if that plan is actually winning you a lot of games.
I'm largely unconvinced that casting a Hex Drinker is better than just casting a Walking Ballista as the Walking Ballista part of it. Especially because so many of those decks you're talking about that are like removal spell dense that you would want that kind of target against. Like, you don't really want Hex Drinker against the Lava Dart decks. You want it against the Death Shadow decks. And just casting a big Walking Ballista against Death Shadow has historically been a fast way to win the game.
So that covers most of what Ranger Captain of Eos does in the deck. The other 3-drop, which has really vaulted the deck up in quality in recent months, has been Skyclave Apparition, which you said you initially... this deck caught your eye because you were looking for the best shell for Skyclave Apparition in Modern. It slotted very naturally in here, where it's a collected company here that gives you 2 white pips for devotion, clears up a lot of things that could be problematic for the deck otherwise, and it seems like there's, if a deck is inherently resistant to Ranger Captain, usually that means they're deploying cheap permanents to the board, and that's when Skyclave Apparition gives you broad coverage against the other half of the format, so to speak.
Yeah, the funny part is that when I started playing the deck, when I was like, oh, this is a Skyclave Apparition deck, it was just a sideboard card. And I think that the thing that pushes it over the top into the main deck is that double white pip for devotion. That kind of really wrapped up the whole... I said this deck was initially not very good at being scrappy beatdown. Once you start adding the additional double white pips of, Auriok Champion and Skyclave Apparition and Ranger Captain, it's really easy just to battle people down with Heliod. That card is still a 3-mana 5/5 when it starts attacking. It does not mess around with actually winning the game. So Skyclave Apparition, it's also kind of fundamentally hard to build decks in Modern that aren't weak to Skyclave Apparition in some respect. You would think that the format would have adapted, and it has a little bit, but there's only so many cards you can put in your Modern deck that are not permanents, or basically only Esper is the only deck that really, really avoids Skyclave Apparition. Esper and the Titan Shift. Those are the only 2 decks that really avoid it, because every other deck just needs to play a good permanent.
Yeah, I think that the removal of Simian Spirit Guide is a big player there, where now a lot of the, I guess, spell-based combo decks, if you want to call them that, most of which would have been weak to Ranger Captain anyway, but a lot of the decks that don't really need to set up anything early have been either outright banned or significantly hobbled by recent developments. And so, yeah, if you want to play a combo deck now, that combo deck probably has to expose something early. And sometimes it's something which you expect to live because most decks don't have good ways of dealing with it, but Apparition is such a versatile answer that it gets caught up in that net anyway. So against Amulet, for example, tagging their turn 1 Amulet, which usually in most matchups you can count on surviving, can be the difference between them killing you on turn 3 and their draw mostly being non-functional. Or even against a deck like Tron, which does not jump out as a deck that's weak to Skyclave Apparition, sometimes they're priced into playing their Expedition map on turn 1 and you get to tag it and the game is over because they just don't participate in the game anymore. So you can almost always find a use for Apparition, even if it's not a good one. And when it is a good one, often that is the best thing you could be doing in any deck like this.
Yeah, it's also just the lineup against Prowess. Apparition is so good against that deck, because the big thing with Apparition is that, it does look like it should be better to be exiling bigger things. Exiling smaller stuff is just better. If your opponent's playing a small thing that they care about, you want to exile it, because then the Apparition rounds down to 0 when it dies. It's basically just a straight up Shriek Maul, as opposed to giving them a 3/3 or a 4/4. So when you're exiling Monastery Swiftspear with it, that's just the key.
Yeah, and that's the draw to, I would say, both the Prowess decks and the Shadow decks in this format, is your 1-drops or your 2-drops are routinely bigger than any other creatures in the format, and if those creatures are replaced by something that's capped at a 1/1 or a 2/2, even if your Apparition dies, which sometimes is easier said than done, then that's a really excellent exchange for you. One interesting dynamic there, though, is we mentioned that Heliod is about as hard to kill as a card can be in Modern. One great argument for Skyclave Apparition is it can kill Heliod and anything else in that weird, unique space. And so how does that dynamic play out in the mirror? Because I've seen other Heliod pilots say that often they just won't cast a Heliod early because that is your most important card, and getting that one tagged by Apparition can be a game ender.
I think it often, a lot of this depends on how legendary Heliod is in the game, right? If you have multiple Heliods, you can kind of expose it and force your opponent to go down a certain route of development. If you don't, you know, that's a different story. Order of operations, kind of, you're trying to stick multiple spike feeders so you can go off in response to them, accompanying for a Skyclave. The mirror is also just kind of weird because of the dynamics of like infinite life versus infinite life. And, someone trying to, you need to go to like the next level of infinite to actually close out the game. And then I don't want to talk. So I guess we should talk about the Magic Online dynamics of this deck.
Yes.
I don't really want to talk about the mirror match Magic Online dynamics because that's never a good thing.
I was going to say, like, if you are a math scientist, then you get into this discussion of infinities with different cardinalities or whatever, and that gets all very technical. In Magic, what you have to think about is there's Magic Online Infinity and there's Paper Magic Infinity, where in paper, you can say in one breath, all right, I'm at 1 billion life, and that's fine. That's gospel. On Magic Online, it's a lot messier. And sometimes that doesn't actually have a meaningful difference. Like, you have to go through however many minutes of clicking, and sometimes if your opponent is being not even sportsmanlike, but charitable, maybe generous, I guess is the word, then they can help you along in that process. But against some of the aggro decks, let's say, being at 600 is the same as being at 1 billion. There are some matchups or situations, though, where it is meaningfully different. So back in the Field of the Dead days, this came up a lot, where Field just led to, am I safe to call it, exponentially increasing damage over time? Quadratically increasing damage? Whatever it is. It got real big real fast, is the point. And so your tedious clicking would very quickly get outmatched by them just getting an additional 2 off of power on the board every turn and then attacking with all the power that they previously amassed. Nowadays, it mostly comes up in the context of Dryad decks, where, like, if they establish Dryad, maybe you gain infinite life, but then they mow down your board with Dryad and Valakut. They can control anything else you deploy to the battlefield, and then unless you can remove Dryad itself, and you kind of need an apparition for every Dryad, then nothing you commit to the board is going to be safe again. And then also, if they're making a land drop every turn, they get multiple Valakuts, they can quickly whittle down whatever life total you got yourself up to. So I don't know how often it actually comes up, because usually they can be infinite life or they can't, but Heliod being, and we don't need to talk about this if you don't want to, but Heliod being the best deck puts it in a weird spot where now in maybe the most important matchup, which is the mirror, its central core premise doesn't necessarily work anymore.
So I guess I should specify the dynamics of the mirror. So the mirror does have lopsided games where someone goes off and the other person doesn't. Like, that happens a decent amount. And the Walking Ballista combo basically always beats the Spike Feeder combo, right? You can, like, once you go for pinging their Spike Feeder, they're committed to like a certain amount of life, and then your Ballista just goes off over all of it later, or you just, kill all other things forever. It's not, that's not a big deal. It'll get resolved. The issue is when, like, people are speculatively gaining infinite life, and then that translates to infinite clicks. That's a pain. In most other matchups, so when I was playing the deck, and I'll caveat this with, I've played a lot of Magic Online. I've played a lot of Magic Online combos, a lot of click-heavy combos, and I think I've only found one deck ever that has bested me with the clock, and it was like one of the Pauper Cloud of Fairies decks. I don't really want to think about like Sage Rosetta's and whatever. This deck is not that bad. I think that before the technological advance of there's a right-click menu to save targets, so you can save targets on your Heliod, and you can right-click your triggers on the stack to always yield to them. And once you just set up those yields when you start going off a Spike Feeder, you just kind of like click Spike Feeder, and then the thing just happens. And I think that the other thing about it is that it's not like a punishing combo. You can't really misclick, because as soon as your click registers on Magic Online, like, the stack just resolves itself once you have all the like auto yields set up and everything. So you can just kind of like keep clicking. It takes, I want to say, about like a second to life. So realistically, you're spending, a few minutes a match, probably twice. Going off 3 times in a match and losing is really weird. It really doesn't happen with this deck. So, maybe you're saying, oh, well, I'm playing with a 15-minute clock every match. But this isn't like a deck that routinely plays super long games. It's really not a huge deal. you have to think a little bit about your clock. Like when you're playing against prowess, you probably only need like 150 life. You know, they're not going to kill you through that before you set up a combo that will defeat them through anything, especially because of Oriok champion. But against, like the control decks or whatever, you got to think through what's going on, think how much life you actually want to gain. But you just kind of have to like settle for like 200, 250 sometimes and just assume that like 5% of the time that things don't go your way, you lose the game, whatever. So basically my only advice is like, you don't need to go to 500 life. And you should only be running out of clock if you are choosing to be too safe with the amount of life you gain.
Yeah, for me, it was Pyromancer Ascension that broke my spirit on Magic Online, where like if you had to manually loop Noxious Revivals targeting each other and then something else, and like you had to work a Manamorphose in there, so it was mana neutral, but you were also ending up up a card net in the equation somehow, which I still don't fully understand. That was what I remember. There was a brief window when looting was legal that I thought Phoenix with Ascension and then Noxious Revival as your free spell might just be completely busted. But I never got to really test that theory because actually doing that on Magic Online was just, absolutely impossible. In any case, I think the mechanics of doing this on Modo are easy enough once you get the hang of them, as you said. And I don't know if this being a Magic Online only deck at this point is really obscuring like the level to which it's really dominant, where in paper it's a lot easier. Because as you say, I think this is a fairly corner case thing that most of the time you can navigate around. It's just unfortunate that it has to be an issue at all. And that's not really a Magic Online thing. It's more of a just, by necessity, this is going to be a problem. But it's unfortunate that it's a discussion we even need to have at all.
Yeah, You can't code an infinite you can't code arbitrary it's a whole thing. You can't do it before anyone asks. You can only just add quality of life things that make it a little easier. It's just like programmatically not a thing you can do unless you have like a million corner cases coded in. It's just bad. So it's gonna be what it is.
But Ari, we have chess clocks on Modo. Why can't we have chess clocks on paper? It's the same, right? Like, but what's the big deal?
I distinctly remember the original chess clock article that Riki Hayashi put out. The first time it was tested, his opponent lost the game because they just never pressed the chess clock, and then he just sat there.
Still a seminal work after all these years, but so that covers most of the kind of mechanical, logistical things. Are there any, I guess, final mechanical tricks that people might not be aware of, or any kind of tactical considerations which it is worth knowing about once you're picking up the deck for the first time?
I think that we might just want to talk about the one instant in the deck, Collected Company, instead of getting too deep on the tactics. We covered pretty well this using Spike Feeder as an instant, in response to removal or holding it to respond to removal. But most of the deck is sorceries besides that, right? So I think Collected Company is a good place to start. And as always, it's just good to think about when you're casting it. Force Negation kind of does make that a juggle between letting your opponent untap versus letting them cast Force Negation for free. Because, Collected Company is random, but like the idea with this deck is that it's randomly going to be good no matter what you hit. Want to take your shot in the Strixhaven Championships and compete with the best in the world? The MPL, the Rivals, and all the other great players who made their way there? You can earn your invite for that event by playing in the SCG Tour online. Not only are those invites to the Strixhaven Championship available for the winner of each qualifier, there are thousands of dollars in prizes, tens of thousands of MTG Arena gems, and MTG Arena Qualifier weekend invitations. That's right. Even if you don't win it all and take home a Strixhaven Championship invite, you can lock up one of your monthly MTG Arena Qualifier weekend bids via the SCG Tour online. Skip that sweat of just staring at your mythic rank on the last day of the month, hoping it doesn't fall from, 900th to 1400th. Seriously, all you gotta do is log in for a Friday night, play an event you probably wanted to play anyways, and boom, do well at that, and you're on your way to not having to bemoan every match loss that tosses you from 98% to 1100th place. Visit scgtouronline.starcitygames.com for details on our upcoming dates and formats. The road to the Strixhaven Championship starts with the SCG Tour Online.
Yeah, I guess if it's a post-board game against a Force of Negation deck, then you should be able to safely assume that they don't have it because it literally has no other targets, and the one good target won't even be a valid target sometimes unless you're hardcasting your spell. But people, I guess, misboard or they just don't have anything good to bring in. So I guess be aware that you can still get got by that, I suppose. But for the most part, yeah, that this is the one instant in the deck, and therefore the one card where that kind of timing consideration really comes into play.
Yeah, and the Force Negation thing is kind of weird because like a decent number of sideboard cards you could bring in against people are spells, so they might just want it anyways. It's kind of weird. Like Veil of Summer comes up, where if you are going to cast a spell on your main phase and then cast Veil of Summer on their first counter spell, they might want to have a free Force Negation back for that. Veil of Summer is still a hell of a Magic card, so.
Yeah, that's certainly valid. And this is, I guess, if you read any of our content on Star City Games, you will see this deck referred to as Selesnya Company. And there have been decks which you could also call that in Modern in the past, whether it's these kind of just fair beatdown mid-rangey decks or other creature combo decks using Company as a way to get their combo pieces in order. How reliant would you say this deck is on Collected Company as a card? And how much should the deck be building with it in mind? So, for example, one deck building choice that we'll get onto is Utopia Sprawl versus the more traditional choice of just more mana creatures. Or when you're looking at sideboard cards, how big of a deal is it that you have, let's say, a creature that can be found by Collected Company over what might be a more powerful or efficient sideboard card in the abstract?
So I think with this deck, it doesn't matter nearly as much as past decks, specifically the absence of Gavany. Well, so first of all, like I said, you're not a great beatdown deck, and the absence of Gavany Township means that like hitting Birds plus Noble Hierarch is not great. Though we can talk more about the decision between Birds and Noble and Utopia Sprawl and Arbor Elf a little later. The experience I've had with this deck is that there's so many 3-drops in your deck that you just like aren't cutting ever. Like you're not cutting your Ranger Captains and your Heliod's and your Spike Beaters, that like even as you're cutting down on company hits, like just finding one of those at instant speed along with whatever is usually good enough. It's not that big a deal to be, cutting the bad company hits from your deck after sideboarding for spells because they just weren't good hits to begin with and you can move on with your life. I Also, so hitting mana dorks, like a Arbor Elf or whatever, off company only really matters when you're going for these like ballista kill chains on the spot later on, and even then, only a little bit. So like having Utopia Sprawl instead is not a huge deal.
Yeah, it seems like in this deck, your company hits are maybe more polarized than in almost any other company deck, where let's say you already have Heliod, a second copy of Heliod, does nothing for you if you see it in your top 6 versus like let's say the Jund sacrifice decks with company in Historic or Pioneer, where if you have one Mayhem Devil, you really, really want to see another Mayhem Devil, or whatever your central combo piece is. And likewise, if maybe Aureoch Champion is your best card in the matchup, maybe Aureoch Champion has basically no text in the matchup. And ditto for, there is some overlap between Ranger Captain being good and Skyclave Apparition being good, but there are matchups where only one of them is, and so you really want that one, and you really don't want the other one. So often your companies have like a very high ceiling, but also a very low floor, where, I've definitely had games with this deck where I just need like a medium company to lock the game up, and instead I just get absolutely nothing. I spent 4 mana to just toss cards into the void.
Yeah, but in those spots, like let's say it was a random creature that you sideboarded in that pile instead of whatever, like you just wanted the Heliod. You didn't, or the Spike Feeder or whatever. It doesn't really matter, like that you would have another piece of random cardboard with power and toughness. You just need that card that matters, and you would side that in if you could, but there's only so many of those that exist.
Yeah, I remember when Paolo was talking about why he cut company from his Gruul aggro deck in Historic, and his argument was that if you compare it to some of these more creature combo based decks, then the value of hitting just a thing, whether it's a 1/1 Pelt Collector in the mid game or a Burning Tree Emissary or something, that card wasn't really doing anything for you. Whereas in a sacrifice deck, let's say, where all of your parts work together, just having a body has some inherent value to it. And in this deck, maybe this is what helps to justify the move to Utopia Sprawl over, let's say, Noble Hierarch, where how much is Noble Hierarch really doing for you, or just any random dead creature versus, like, there are cards that you really need to hit. And so Company isn't a direct tutor for those, but there is a big delta usually between games where you have Heliod and games where you don't. And so Company as a card which can help you hit Heliod some of the time, like, that would be an argument for it in and of itself.
Yeah, and so the past version of this deck did play Eldamari's Call as a tutor directly for Heliod. And every time you did that, you just felt like you were spewing so much mana and just never got anywhere. So Company just like having this inherent return of mana, just like giving you like we said, this is mono Spellskite tribal. So in the matchups where you care about doing things, like doing a lot of things doesn't matter all the time. But when you're playing against removal spells, just putting like an Auriok Champion and a Spike Feeder on the battlefield does matter. So like just accumulating the value there is important enough. Company, not spending mana on nothing's important. It is just really a little bit better than every other alternative. I was not a big fan of sideboarding it out in a lot of matchups. Largely because unlike other Company decks, like you can just main phase a Company and kill your opponent in a lot of spots. But I can imagine there are worlds where you do sideboard out a copy or two. But I haven't really thought through. I've never brought myself to do it, is really what it is.
There was a brief phase where people were playing Archangel of Thune as more copies of Heliod, which also accelerated things like, Spike Feeder would now directly give infinite damage as well as infinite life without needing Heliod and Mentor to do that. Or if you were just playing a fair game, then Archangel would win a lot of those fair games while dodging cards like Fatal Push and Skyclave Apparition. That seems to mostly have receded now, but do you think, or did you think there was any merit to that?
I don't think it's horrible. I think that very specifically, and I think this will tie us into our next discussion, that was tied to playing Birds of Paradise and Noble Hierarch over Utopia Sprawl and Arbor Elf. Once you get to that point, just like controlling an Archangel of Thune and doing the normal Archangel of Thune thing starts to become pretty attractive. It also is like a card that beats other Skyclave Apparition decks heads up. Like not necessarily the mirror, it's kind of, I mean, it's another combo piece, but like hitting your opponent with an Archangel is just the wrong scale. But if your opponent's like some stupid Death and Taxes deck and they can't Apparition it, that's kind of annoying for them. And it's just really, it's the same thing as Gavany Township, where you want to be triggering Archangel of Thune for non-combo purposes when you just have this arbitrary, massive on the battlefield power and toughness cardboard. And Utopia Sprawl doesn't position you to do that quite as well. And also gives you less hits for Company when Archangel's not a hit for Company. And Archangel's also like an expensive thing that makes Companying into another mana dork a really good idea. It all just kind of piles up. And I don't think you really want to look at Archangel unless you are going down the Noble Hierarch Birds of Paradise road.
Let's get into the merits of that versus Utopia Sprawl then, because Utopia Sprawl was one of the big advances for this deck and quickly became the universal standard. What are the merits of that versus that more traditional setup in your eyes?
The big one, the very big one, is if you just go Arbor Elf into Utopia Sprawl on turn 1 Arbor Elf, turn to Utopia Sprawl. That's 4 mana. You Company on turn 2. The game ends. It's fine. You'll win that game. The really explosive draws are the biggest draw to Utopia Sprawl plus Arbor Elf. And that's not just this deck. That's literally just across the board in every deck. In the, like, nonsense green-red pawn... I don't know. Do you want to call those decks Ponza? I don't even know. The green-red piles. That's, really the only thing that ties them together. They're like, I'm going
to... I believe the editorial line is Gruul Land Destruction, Ari.
Okay, Gruul Land Destruction. Yeah, you get away with putting a bunch of Blood Red Elves and Pillages in your 2021 deck because when you go, Arbor Elf Utopia Sprawl, you just you want to spend your mana on whatever. You're playing a cube deck. This is more powerful cube stuff. It's your Soul Ring, it's your Derogatory Speaker. You just do whatever. The other reason is, I said this last week, I believe you are currently allowed to play exactly one creature in your deck that dies to Lava Dart. Because if they Lava Dart your creature and then have the flashback to shoot you and prowess something. It's not like that much worse than Searing Blaze on a trade. You're fine with it. Everything falls apart when your second creature gets lava darted. That's the bad stuff. And when you start playing 8 Noble Hierarch Birds of Paradise, then you start losing multiple creatures a game to a single lava dart, and your deck stops functioning.
Is it completely illegal to play Gilded Goose?
I think in this deck, yes. You're trying to play too many consecutive 3 drops and too many consecutive 4 drops. It's not like the Oko. So the trick with Gilded Goose is that you specifically either want to do something with the food, so like the mono green food decks in standard, or you want to, be using it exactly once and then figure it out later. So that was like the Gilded Goose into Oko era. Like all you cared about was turn 2 Oko, and then the game was over from there. So who cares if your Gilded Goose is a deck card? That's not how this deck operates. You literally need to put 2 pieces of cardboard into play that cost 3, and it's kind of a pain. And like the one shot burst of mana, and you just don't really have anywhere on your curve to goose again and refill it up, and you're not going to play like Trail of Crumbs. I don't think Gilded Goose works out quite the way you want it to.
Yeah, like you really want to be going 1 into 3 into 4 in most games, and Goose just fundamentally can't do that. And then also you build your mana base around the expectation of having these 1 mana accelerants, where if you still have your normal land count, then you're going to flood, but then you need to prepare for the possibility of your mana accelerant dying. So it's a tough tightrope balancing act. Utopia Sprawl does help to mitigate that to some degree, because it's just not going to die nearly as often as a random O1 is going to. But with that in mind, if you have Gilded Goose, then yeah, okay, if it lives, you go 1 into 3. But then if you miss your land drop, you can't cast another 3-drop. And this deck is built to maximize company, which means you want as many 3-drops as you can pack in there without destroying your own curve. And not being able to cast that second 3-drop is kind of a disaster that you force upon yourself.
Yeah, Gilded Goose is certainly a modern power level card. You just really have to go down the road that was originally paired with Goose, where you're using the fact that it's effectively Tree of Tales. I don't think you really want to mess with it in other shells.
Utopia Sprawl also opens up this weird back and forth dance versus Blood Moon, where if you have Utopia Sprawl, then you need more forests, and if that forest is a temple garden, then getting that clowned by Blood Moon is kind of a disaster. That said, one of the main Blood Moon decks at the moment is the mono red deck, which is also a Lava Dart deck, so not like Birds of Paradise or something is much more reliable there. And also the other major Blood Moon deck is the red-green deck that often has stuff like Bonecrusher Giant and so on. So there is, you're never fully safe whichever path you take. And then once you have Utopia Sprawl, you want more forests, but that also means more basic forests, which can help you get around Blood Moon, whether you're fetching them or not. It does hurt you in a deck that has a lot of double white pips by design for Heliod, where having to fetch basic forest means you then have to sprawl on white and then get another white source from somewhere. And then if you're not playing Sprawl, then the benefit, I suppose, is you get to play more non-basic lands, like Razorverge Thicket is the big one for stabilizing your mana, but then that makes you worse in the face of Blood Moon. And then some of these other utility lands, like Pendlehaven, Gavney Township, just much easier to justify any one of those when they're not indirectly competing with some kind of forest.
Yeah, it's a lot of, you're going to get burned by it in some capacity in some games. And I just really always fall back on that, 1 to 4 mana jump as just like, well, I'm doing the closest thing I can to Mox Opal, and I'm not going to worry about, all the second degree ways this or the other configuration can screw me over.
Yeah, I also have seen lists just playing townships anyway, because they think that you can afford some number of colorless sources probably, and that's the best one if you're going down that route. And here, colorless is also a proxy for non-forest, where you have to watch that count as well. But just having like any creature combo deck in the past, or even any like medium green-white mid-range deck, has traditionally turned to Gavney Township as a way to break those fair games open.
I'm skeptical of it here. It is good to load up an Auriok champion with counters in a lot of matchups. If an Auriok champion has a 1/1 is hard to beat, a 2/2 is exceptionally hard to beat. But at the same time, I feel like there's a lot of opportunities to have like Utopia Sprawl, Heliod, Gavney Township, and just be like, what is this combination of cards accomplishing?
You certainly regret your life choices at that point. And I think some of those life choices all play into each other, where once you, like, let's say you replace Utopia Sprawl with birds or Noble Hierarch, at that point you have more just like random creatures lying around, whether it's naturally or sometimes you company, and otherwise it would only have turned up one creature, or like one good creature and one bad creature, and now you get to replace that bad creature with another mana accelerant, and then that opens up the door for Township to be activated more easily and then do more when it does activate. So I think it makes more sense in those builds. But yeah, if you are just on Utopia Sprawl, then you are working against some of the safety that Utopia Sprawl offers in pursuing that. It certainly is a risk.
Yeah, I think that at most I would play one Township if I'm playing Sprawl, which I will be playing Sprawl if I'm playing this deck. And I think any more is kind of inviting disaster, even if that is what Canister chose to play recently.
Well, Canister tries a lot of things, and I don't mean that as like indirect shade, but I think that's what you should be doing, right? Like, I think you should certainly get the reps in with the default stock builds of Heliod, and then maybe it's worth trying some of the more out there things just to see if they have merit or not. And in the spirit of that, are there any kind of Heliod adjacent experiments that you think are worth exploring, or any tweaks to the deck that maybe are worth a look?
Frankly, I don't really have a lot of those on my list of things I care about, because I feel like the deck as is, no one's presented anything that is especially to the point that I feel like I need to change what the deck is doing. It's still the best deck. Like, I guess you could work towards improving it in some aspects, but it feels like a lot of the stuff that's in the deck is the reason it's still the best deck, and I don't want to fiddle too much with that. I think that Conclave Mentor is a bit of a negotiable spot. It doesn't do a whole lot, but you're allowed to cut that card. So if you're looking for something that you can fiddle with, I would look right at the Conclave Mentors, and just know that the cost of that is largely with your aggressive kind of fast combo kills against decks where the infinite life is not quite enough.
It seems like between all of the 3-drops being spoken for, like you need your Spike Feeders, your Ranger Captains, your Skyclave Apparitions, and so on. You've got your Heliods, your Companies, your at least 8 Mana Accelerants. Maybe you play a 9th, and that's one of the flex slots. It seems like most of the slots in the deck are spoken for at this point, and to the extent that you can make choices anymore is over exactly what your configuration of 2-drops are.
Yeah, and Scavenging Ooze is just slightly clunkier, slightly more vulnerable to removal than Auriok Champion, and not this direct aggressive combo piece the way Conclave Mentor is. So it's kind of fallen by the wayside lately, but I don't think it's too far out of the question. It's also just like a little slow against Reg. That's kind of a problem these days for it, especially with the whole thing where Thrilling Discovery doesn't put the Dredgers in the graveyard before you.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's also just a massive play versus draw difference with that card in the matchup, where, like, on the draw, especially if you don't have that turn 1 Mana Accelerant, you just play a naked Scavenging Ooze, and either they assemble a massive board around that, or they just dredge 20 cards to find a Conflagrate, and your Ooze dies, and then you die in short order. So you can't actually rely on that as a hate piece in the matchup, which makes it a lot less appealing. Would you find yourself playing that 9th mana creature, do you think? Or what would you use some of those flex slots on?
I think I would make sure that I have 4 of... So there are lists that have been moving a champion to the sideboard. I don't think I'm quite there yet. There's still a lot of prowess. Mono Red, the Obosh deck, won the most recent challenge. And even if they have like Rampaging Ferocidon and Bone Crusher Giant, you can just like play your Auriok Champion in such a fashion that those are not going to end the game for you. I think that I'm into the 9th mana creature over the 4th Conclave Mentor, especially because Mentor is not the most exciting card in multiples. And I think that you could consider a 23rd land, especially with your deck having 4 Horizon Canopies. It's just consistency is really what I'm going to layer here. Just don't lose to your own deck as much as possible.
Canopy is a card that I don't think we've mentioned at all by name yet, but that's a subtly important part of the mana base, I think, where usually with these decks where you have 8 or more mana accelerants, there is a severe risk of flooding, and so having an untapped on-color dual land, which can let you go, green on 1 into double white on 2, which also can be cashed in for a card in the late game, and you're gaining enough incidental life that the damage is less impactful than it might be in some other decks. That card feels almost tailor-made for this deck in a way that you see many other decks find a way to include canopy lands because they're so fundamentally powerful, but it feels more at home here than it does in many of those other decks.
Yeah, it always has been in these decks. The creature combo decks have always been among the best Horizon Canopy decks. Second only to humans, which would run all Horizon lands if it could.
Yeah, in terms of these more radical experiments, there's a Zuma Heliod list floating around that touches red for sideboard Magus of the Moon and or Showdown of the Skulls, where I think Magus is interesting, given that, as you said, the finals of one of the challenges this weekend was a Blood Moon Mirror, and the deck, or the shell gaining most momentum in the past week has been this 4.5, 5 color Bring to Light deck. It seems like Blood Moon effects are kind of back in a big way in the format, and there is a perverse way sometimes in which Magus of the Moon can be harder to kill than Blood Moon for many decks. I don't know how true that is out of a deck that's already mostly creatures, where if your opponent has random dismembers or something, they're going to be bringing them in regardless. But I guess if you're taking that line, being able to company into it is a tiebreaker there.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested in your opinion on this because you had the most immediate experience with the Scapeshift deck. How good is a Blood Moon effect against that deck? Historically, especially against Dryad of the Elysian Grove, it's been less good than you think it would be. But is that the case with this Bring to Light super overextended shell?
Against the Dryad list in particular, you get into the weird timing issue with Blood Moon where whichever was cast second wins, basically. So if there is a Blood Moon effect already in play and you cast Dryad, then your lands are all rainbow. Whereas if Dryad was in play and now they cast Blood Moon or Magus, then that still shuts down all of the non-basics. So that adds this weird dependency to that. That being said, those cards are still very, very good. And you would definitely want... I think that is the best card that you can have if you want to slant towards that deck in some capacity.
Okay. And, talking about things that are historically good against this archetype, the big mana decks like Scapeshift have always been a not great matchup for all the various green creature combo decks, with maybe the exception of the Devoted Druid deck that is a lot faster and a lot less flexible in terms of surviving removal. So that is, people have previously been on Damping Sphere because beating the Urza's Tower decks is more important. And you're kind of just like, well, I'll just ride it out against Amulet. It'll be fine. And, Sphere is okay against them. But I do think Magus of the Moon would be a step up. It is... So normally there's this whole thing where Blood Moon isn't great against Urza's Tower because your opponent will just eventually play lands and cast those cards. But if you're also a combo deck, it does kind of help a lot there.
Yeah, I think also now, because many of the Tron decks are moving away from Oblivion Stone, where all its dust is picking up steam because you can turn 3 that, and that actually does deal with Heliod, unlike Oblivion Stone, and you need that sweeper effect on turn 3 if you're going to have any chance against Prowess a lot of the time. There's that, and then also it's not as much of a lock as it used to be that Tron is playing Khan the Great Creator, and that was actually one of the easier ways for them to beat the Blood Moon effect was you have a mediocre draw that has to take a turn off for Blood Moon, they get to 4 lands naturally, they cast Khan, and now you're actually in trouble. In a deck like this, you can pressure their Khan fairly easily, and it's less likely that they are going to have it in the first place. So I think just the card Blood Moon is actually a lot better against Tron than it used to be.
Yeah, and those decks, aside from Scapeshift, are completely just out of removals. They have even Eldrazi Tron has 2 dismembers and 2 spatial contortions and maybe some ballistas that they can't even get big enough to kill Magus in a reasonable time frame most of the time. They're not the best at killing Magus relative to just dealing with Blood Moon. So it's kind of fine to just have a creature that dies to removal.
I do think Damping Sphere is very good at what it does, but now that the big mana pillar of the format is diversifying, where traditionally Damping Sphere has been very good against Tron and pretty good against Amulet if you can close the game in the next few turns, but it doesn't do anything against the actual Valakut decks of the format. Now that people are moving towards like Dryad, Bring to Light, that kind of thing, where Damping Sphere doesn't do anything, I do think that matchup can be tricky. And so if you want to hedge against that at the same time, then this approach might be worth it. I do question how easily you can tweak the mana base, though, because in theory, yes, you play like a Stomping Ground and a Sacred Foundry, and you have your fetchers to set that up, and I guess you can Utopia Sprawl on red if you need to. But in a deck which, we've already highlighted the issue sometimes with you have to fetch basic forest for your Sprawl, and then where is the second white coming from? And, if you have to put a Sprawl on a non-basic forest and then you play a Moon Effect and the Sprawl falls off, like there are a lot of ways where you can lock yourself out of casting spells as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, the more non-basics you add to your deck to add another color, the harder it is to Utopia Sprawl plus Burn the way you want it to. Though,
Yeah, it kind of... It tempts you with a thing that you then make yourself weaker to its own symmetry for. It's, it leads you down a dangerous path.
You could just cut if you just don't play the Gavany Township, that's a free land there that you can splash with, though. So you're already half of the way there.
There's some free real estate for you, yeah. And then the other aspect, which I'm less sure about from this this idea, was the Showdown of the Skulls, and I think this is motivated by hard control, most notably the Esper control deck that TSP Yendrick and other people have been crushing fairly consistently with. That deck has been a hard matchup, along with control like that in general, and you can play some Veils, but those can be hit or miss sometimes. I've seen some sideboard threats like Gideon Ally of Zendikar was one that people have used to good effect, and you can try just like random creatures that are hard to kill, but I don't think there are any good ones that you can hit with company, unfortunately. Like, in theory, Tireless Tracker is good, but I don't think it actually does much in practice. So if you want a more out there measure, then I guess this is on the table. That being said, I think it's tough for it to do much in a deck where your curve is so heavily skewed towards 3-drops for company anyway that like you play your Showdown, and next turn maybe you can cast like 1.5 spells on average off it, and you get like a counter here and a counter there, but I don't know if that's actually a game-winning sequence against control decks with a good draw.
I'm just skeptical of the way to beat, counter spells into Fairy Hero of Dominaria being more 4-mana sorceries in your deck of all 3-mana sorceries. I can't imagine that lines up right. If I'm trying to beat that deck, I'm just playing all the Veil of Summers, and just every game my plan is to tap 3 mana, cast a card, counter their thing, draw a card, and just crush them in that way.
So that answers my follow-up question. I guess my follow-up question was going to be, is it time for Voice of Resurgence? I guess it's never time for Voice of Resurgence, but is there a chance, Ari? Is it finally happening?
I think you could make an excuse for it if you went back to the Birds of Paradise list. Specifically, you actually need the tokens to have a bit more size when the trigger first happens. Like, if you just have a voice and they counter your spell, and it's like, I've got a 2/2. It's like, okay, so you have 2 2/2s. You've cast Call the Cavalry. No one cares. And then the control deck does some other stuff. But once you start, like, the extra, the extra bodies with Township, it just all kind of adds up to an actually threatening shell. And I've used that to effect in the past, like grid effect in the past against these decks, just like 4 Voice of Resurgence and slam at them. But I think a lot of other things have to shift in the format for that to be good.
So I think that covers most of the deck's card choices and the various ins and outs. Just thinking about its wider position in the format, we touched on this last week, where going into Strixhaven, it seemed like this was the best deck, maybe not by like Eldrazi Winter or Simic Urza kind of margins, but still comfortably on top of the format at that point. And the decks gaining the most from Strixhaven were were decks that were already good matchups in Dredge and the various Power Shells. Did those decks gain enough that the matchups are now more even, or maybe even slightly in their favor? Or if anything, is that an even better reason to still play Heliod?
I don't think it really changed too much in the positioning of those matchups. The prowess matchup is still you just kill all their stuff and they die, or you know, miss a little and they get under you with a little bit of tempo. And some extra one drops helps a little, but just because you're like trying to kill everything, I think if you just like missed on killing enough, the games where they go one drop, one drop, one drop, if you have, if they had like one drop, two drop, the difference between like you killing two of their things and getting hit once and you not killing two of their it's gonna break the same way either way, right? You either killed all their stuff or you didn't. And with Dredge, I think that it's easy enough for this deck to just beat Dredge because Infinite Life defeats Dredge hands down. Um, but also like you have good cards like Wheel of Sun and Moon as hate cards. Like Wheel of Sun and Moon is kind of cool. And by cool, I mean I played against it as mill when I was testing that deck. It was horrible. I don't think you're too hard up for just like if either of those decks is really scary, it doesn't take you a lot to really overcome those matchups.
Yeah, if you decide to care about beating Dredge, then you can beat them even harder. I guess if you really care about beating prowess, is it just like more Path to Exiles, more cheap removal of some kind, or is there some nuclear option you can turn to if you really want to hammer that down?
You have 4 Oriot Champion in your deck. They're just in there.
You do, but like some of the prowess decks have like gigantic sprite dragons or storming entities or something, or I don't know. I guess I maybe have too much respect for the prowess decks and like the games you lose to them, especially as Heliod, it feels like, well, they needed to have the top of the range and there was nothing you can do. Is that true though? Like, are there measures you can take if you want to hedge against that? Or is that just like, okay, you take the L, 20% of the time, but the rest of the time you're well set up?
I would look towards Oust and Eternal Witness as the 2 cards that immediately come to mind as ways to shore up that matchup. Again, you're just trying to make as many of your cards into Shriek Maws as possible because I don't think they can actually kill you without a creature attacking. Oust is like fairly, it's not like as good as it is against like Mana Dorks, but it's pretty good against the prowess things. It's really good against Death Shadow too. And then once you start going down that road and you can like Eternal Witness to recur even more removal or recur Collected Company and spare your opponent in cards, those are the 2 cards that immediately come to mind as ways, again, to layer that strategy of if you kill all their creatures, you're going to win the game.
So as the resident Heliod expert on this card, is there anything else that you feel like needs to be thrown into the mix here?
I don't really think so. I think this deck is just shockingly straightforward. It's not like these weird cutting of the toolbox from like the green creature toolbox deck really just makes it kind of much more straightforward than it used to be. And we saw a little bit of this with the Devoted Druid decks over the last few years. And now this deck is just another step of that. And I think we have finally kind of moved past the era of Birthing Pod into just, this is Splinter Twin. This is what Splinter Twin looks like these days. It's green and white. Deal with it.
You've played through all of the kind of broken, degenerate iterations of Modern over the years. How good is Heliod as a best deck? Like, how far is it above everything else that's going on compared to some of the wild stuff we've seen in Modern past?
It is. I mean, we saw one of those this year, right? There was literally a period where you could cascade into Tibalt, and that was just like that was like a top 5 broken moment. We've had a lot of those. I would put it. It's. I don't think it's. See, the thing that immediately comes to mind, and I mentioned this before, was there's actually a period where Obzon Company was the best deck. You talked about playing that deck at the Eldrazi Pro Tour, and it actually had nothing to do with Eldrazi. If you could pull down. Back then, Magic Online just gave people access to all the data. You could just have a bot scraping all the replays of everyone's matches and everything forever. And people did that. And if you pulled down that data, the Obzon Company deck was just like a 5 to 10% favorite against everything. And that's even dealing with like the old combo interface. And
this was like the MTG Pulse data, was it?
Yes, exactly. And that's about where this deck feels like, where you are like a 5 to 10% favorite, but we're now in 2021 and people are like not as afraid of playing this deck for a lot of reasons. Your cards are just inherently better. It's just a little more attractive. So a lot of people are playing it and people are pushing back. And, like you said, there was a period where after the Eye of Ugin ban, the Obzon Company deck did get pushed back on and did lose a lot of ground. And this deck is just simply losing less ground than that deck in these spots. So it's like not, it is, maybe Splinter Twin again might just be the best comparison where it's just like this deck was good for a very long time and it never really wasn't good. And I don't know what it's going to take for this deck to not be good. But Modern always surprises you. I didn't expect Death Shadow to stop being good. And then...
So this is a confirmed Splinter Twin situation, you would say?
Oh, exactly. Exactly. It's literally the same thing. You've got an enchantment and a 3-mana creature. And yeah.
What's up, everybody? Cedric Phillips here, stopping by real quick to let you know about one of Star City Games' newest podcasts, The Receivables, hosted by yours truly, alongside my partner in crime, of course, Patrick Sullivan, where the two of us discuss Magic sets, both past and present, from top to bottom. On every episode of The Receivables, you're going to hear us talk about the facts of a set, the mechanics of a set, the cycles of a set, the boring stuff, before we get into some crazy stories of when we were playing Magic during the times that the set was legal. We've got a ridiculous award show where we give out awards like the Char Rumbler Award for weirdest card in a set, the Oko Thief of Crowns Award for best card in the set, and a whole bunch more. Before we finally decide, hey, what card won the set and what letter grade should we give the set? It's a whole lot of fun. We're having a blast recording them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to listen to it and you enjoy it as much as we're enjoying recording them. Where can you find it? StarCityGames.com or wherever else you listen to your podcast. The Receivables every single week here at SCG.
Well, on that note, we have one hell of a Splinter Twin situation for our Nonsense of the Week segment today. And as soon as I saw this list, and I imagine you had this reaction too, there was only one possible contender this week.
Yeah, it feels like it's like the combination of a lot of different nonsenses that have popped up across not just Modern, but other formats. And you just kind of get to put it all together. So this was I have to check if it was 4 colors or 5 colors now, because colors do just kind of slide into decks. But this was a polymorph, Lorehold, the Dragon Lorehold, Fires of Invention, 80 card pile.
Yeah, so this is kind of like the Jeskai Luca of Modern, except we're not stopping at Agent of Treachery. That's too small ball for us. We're getting Velomachus Lorehold into play. We're attacking. We're hoping to flip Time Warp or Savor the Moment, which, if you're not familiar with this, and there's no reason why you should be, 1 blue, you take another turn after this one, but you skip your untap step. And crucially, Velomachus itself has Vigilance. So if you hit that, then you're good to go and spin the wheel again next turn. And this is a Fires of Invention deck as well. So often, once you have Fires in play, the mana system as a concept just doesn't exist anymore. And so you can gladly skip your next untap set because you just don't need mana to cast spells. And so that's fine. And so this deck is capable of some truly terrifying sequences. I do love though that if you have your nut draw, so to speak, of turn 4, fires and then transmogrify your thing and you get Velomachus and attack, you can't cast whatever you hit with Velomachus because you've already cast 2 spells that turn, because you are casting the spells, not copying. So you have to think whether it's really worth casting the fires if you can afford to hold off. But Fires of Invention is just a truly absurd card that can handle some amount of anti-synergy. And it feels like if we get to a spot where there's some deck that suddenly breaks out and takes over the format and the pieces of it were there in plain sight, but no one had really just put them together, it would not surprise me if Fires is a big part of that. That is a card which is just ridiculous and probably has some kind of home in Modern. And I'm not convinced this is it exactly, but maybe we're kind of on the right track. I don't know.
There's so many small things that I really just appreciate about this deck. Like the fact that there's just randomly 4 Chalice of the Voids for no reason. The fact that there's more Tamio Collector of Tales than there are Jace the Mind Sculptors. The fact that there's more Transmogrifies than Polymorphs. the fact that your deck is all mountains and 0 Valakuts because you're just Dwarven mining, like that's it. It's the only thing you can polymorph. There's 4 Dwarven mines. That's it.
There have been some like red-green Primeval Titan Transmogrify decks popping up where the gimmick is every turn or every game on turn 3, you are finding Dwarven Mine with 3 other mountains in play off a fetch land, and then casting Transmogrify or Indomitable Creativity to find a Titan, which, if you have Titan in play on turn 3 with a Valakut deck, then you are ending the game on turn 4, if not before. And this is like, oh, you think you're doing cute shit with Transmogrify? Well, get a load of this, and just really going off the rails.
Yeah, and it's also just a Yorion deck. I don't know if that's necessary, but I just enjoy that it is.
Yeah, Fires with Yorion is so messed up, and especially we saw this in the days where there was no companion tax, and you could just Fires into Yorion on the same turn without any effort whatsoever. It also did make me wonder if there's some other like Fires Yorion shell you can play. So I was thinking like, I've been very impressed with Madcap Experiment in the format recently, where against both Dredge and Prowess and Shadow for the most part, and just like red-green Ponza, minus Pillage, and so on, that card is often a one-hit KO. So I thought, can we just play like a Fires Madcap Experiment deck, and then once you have Yorion, you can kind of like lean into maximizing that with stuff like Spreading Seas or Wall of Omens, Omen of the Sea. You can go quite deep down that rabbit hole, but I don't think you even need to necessarily.
Yeah, Spreading Seas actually is kind of interesting. There's a lot of decks that's going to significantly hamper in this format, just cutting their mountains. I mean, Dryad does kind of mess that up a little bit, but like presumably you can build your Spreading Seas deck to fill a Dryad of the Elysian Grove. It also weirdly hurts the like mono blue decks because they're so dependent on a few specific lands for their splash. Spreading Seas might be better than Omen of the Sea in this deck.
Yeah, Spreading Seas are very good against any kind of Urza's Tower deck, obviously. But then also against, let's say, Boros Prowess, all of their spells cost 1 for the most part. And so if you take a land out of commission and it's not tapping for red or white mana, that land is not doing anything. You've effectively cast Stone Rain for 2 mana. And then against Dredge, they're trying to support all 4 colors at once a lot of the time, and I guess blue technically is one of those colors. But if you, if they cast Shriekhorn on 1 off a land and you Spreading Seas it, they're not casting turn 2 Thrilling Discovery. You have a turn of reprieve there. So, and against like the Shadow decks, for example, you have the same dynamic as with Prowess, where you Spreading Seas at Overgrown Tomb, and now that land is just out of commission for most of the game. So that card is like the base case is. You're fine, 2 mana cantrip is not ideal, but it'll do sometimes. And then the ceiling is incredibly high to the point where sometimes that card can just win you the game by itself.
Yeah, and that's not even to talk about just like a lot of times you'll put Spreading Seas in a deck that cares about Cavernous Souls, and you can just it's the original Cleansing Wildfire. That's what it is.
Yeah. So a lot of stuff you can do in like some kind of Fires deck, like it's a shame that you don't get to play Indomitable Creativity because it doesn't work with Fires, although maybe you can accept the clash there and just play it anyway if it's enough of an upgrade. But either way, this deck comfortably clears our bar for how nonsensical a deck has to be to get featured in this segment.
Absolutely. I do want to get on a side tangent. Have you noticed that like the Saturday challenge results have been like very normal stock decks, and then like the Sunday is just when people just let it all loose and
I had not noticed that. I wonder if there's something to do with when the respective challenges start. Because on Saturday you have the Modern Challenge is at 8 a.m. Pacific, so like 11 a.m. East Coast time. Which is like decently accessible for most of Europe, I suppose. And then the Sunday challenge is 4 a.m. Pacific, so 7 a.m. East Coast time. And I wonder if that just like attracts a different crowd, if the Japanese deck builders are really flexing their muscles in the Sunday challenge, but not in the Saturday challenge. I don't know what the actual like underlying reason is there. Do you have any theories?
No, I really have none. It's just always amusing. It's also just very possible that like all the people who are like just gonna buckle down and show up with their best deck. Just want to do it on Saturday and then like watch I don't know. It's not even football season in America, but you know what I mean. Just like they're like the people who have like a regimented weekend, and then the people who are just gonna be like, yeah, I'm gonna stay up till 4 a.m. on Sunday, and we're gonna play Storm's Herald this week. That's just kind of the split I envision.
Yeah, you rack up your solid finish with a stock list of a good deck on Saturday, and then you just let your hair down on Sunday and have some nice, wholesome fun. Or, you know, if you have to work on the weekend, you've had a long Saturday, you want to blow off some steam, that's when you fire up your fires of invention and you get to work, you know?
Yeah, it's a weird phenomenon, and I'm going to be keeping an eye on it.
So would fully recommend to anyone out there either to pick up Heliod with the tips that you've learned here and crush your next tournament, or just pick up some nonsense and get featured in this segment in an upcoming week. You can't go wrong either way. But you can find content by us and many other writers every week over at StarCityGames.com. You can follow us on Twitter at Harvey and Armlax, ARMLX. Is there a good mnemonic there?
There really isn't. It's fine. This is what happens when you make up your screen name when you're 6 and your parents tell you not to use your exact real name, and then you're just like, these are all letters from it. I'm going to type them.
It's like recognizable enough that people can find you, but not so recognizable that you can't get doxed as easily. Like, what's the? I don't know what the exact midpoint is there.
You know, I have it on every platform. It's really hard to get usurped on that. It's pretty distinctive.
Well, let us know what you think, whether it's about the podcast, Ari's Twitter handle, Heliod, or anything else. Make sure you like and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to this on, and leave us a review. That really does help to move our numbers up, especially compared to the other podcasts on this network that we really want to have this internal competition against. And we'll see you all next week. Take care, everyone.